Hello and welcome to another playbook. In this playbook, we're going to talk about a really critical topic. It's about a term that pretty much all of you would have heard if you've worked in the tech ecosystem or if you're aware of the tech ecosystem. So, whether you're an engineer or a designer or a product manager, all of us have heard the term minimum viable product, right? Now, the philosophy of building minimum viable products has been around for a long time, and it's an incredibly useful philosophy. A lot of product teams successfully use this philosophy to build great products. But what's happened is that this term seems to have become corrupted over the years because of the incorrect usage and the incorrect connotations that sort of people have built with the philosophy itself. And I think it's a time that we rejig this term, that we sort of reframed what it really means to have a minimum viable product so that we can build better products. So let's jump in, right? I've often spoken about this, but essentially, I love using inversion wherever possible. So, one way of thinking about inversion is that you flip things around. So, what an MVP isn't, right? Sometimes the way to understand something is to first understand what it isn't, right? So, an MVP is not an excuse to make a crappy product or a feature in name of experimentation and frugality. And this is a mistake I see a lot of teams make. They think that building an MVP gives you an excuse to build something which just doesn't work, which is not complete, and it's just downright a bad product. MVPs are not excuses to make bad products. An MVP has to work and it has to be a good product. In fact, it has to solve a user problem. Two, there are two terms that are there in this phrase: minimum and viable. If you remove viability, then it's just a minimum product, and a minimum product is not a product, right? So building something bare minimum is not part of the philosophy of building minimum viable products. You have to build something minimum, which means you cut out the scope of a lot of things, build something complete, but build something simple and straightforward, but which is viable, which means it actually solves a real problem, right? An MVP is not bereft of market context, right? So the minimum, your threshold, is decided by the market you operate in. It's decided by the competition that you have. Now imagine if you were Tesla and you were building, electric cars for the first time. You're not going to build an electric car with wooden seats, would you? Your minimum is decided by the competition, which are, cars with internal combustion engines and good cars, luxurious cars, which have comfortable seating. So you're not going to build a car which doesn't have comfortable seating. Your minimum, the threshold, has been decided by the market. In that market, you're trying to put out a minimum viable product, which is an electric car, but which is a good car with really good interiors, but happens to be electric, right? So the context matters a lot. And a lot of teams, a lot of products tend to forget the fact that they exist in a context, they exist in a market, and they're competing against other products. So your minimum bar is decided by your competition. Also, the MVP is the first step of a public release process. It is not a beta. It is the first product that you're putting out there. It's the first version of the product. But it is also not the last, which means you're not done just by putting out an MVP. You eventually have to, iterate and get to a much better place. So not a beta product, which is not a product, it's just an early test. But MVP is not that. MVP is the first public version of your product, but it's not the last. You still have to do a lot of work on it, right? It is supposed to be a complete solution to a very significant user problem. Not a partial one, because a partial solution is actually not a solution. Remember, it need not be comprehensive. So you don't need all the bells and whistles in an MVP. It has to solve a problem end to end and be complete in its application, but need not be comprehensive. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, right? Because a lot of teams sometimes build products which actually don't even solve a problem end to end, which again goes back to my first point and my second point, that it's not a product and it's just minimum and not really viable, right? This is a very famous image by Henrik Nieberg, and it's used a lot when people talk about minimum viable products. And as you can clearly see, it really describes what an MVP is. Below, you see what an MVP really is, and at each stage, it is a complete product. It solves the user problem. In this case, the user problem is I want to get from point A to point B, and a skateboard does that, and a cycle does that, and a bike does that, and a car does that. But if you look at the image above, none of the steps are actually complete. They don't really serve a user purpose, and only at the last step do you get a working car. So the first one is clearly not a minimum viable product. The second one is at each step you have a minimum and a viable product, right? Now that we've discussed this, let's talk about a more intuitive approach. So if people have been mistaking what is an MVP, what is a better framing, or maybe not a better framing, but a different framing which allows us to understand this concept better? So I call this the beneficial, complete, and delightful framework, the BCD framework, which is your product needs to provide a benefit to the user, should be complete in its implementation, and delightful, not just functional. So B, C, and D, beneficial, complete, and delightful. Let's jump in and actually see what each of these terms means. Beneficial. So each product feature needs to solve a real problem for the user. The benefit needs to be tangible, quantifiable, and should really move a metric. So beneficial. First and foremost, your product has to be beneficial. Second, it has to be complete. The problem needs to be solved end to end. A partial solution is not a solution. It need not be comprehensive though, and this is a mistake which people make. Complete and comprehensive are two very different things, right? For example, when Google Docs started, it only had 3% of the features of Microsoft Word, but whatever features it had worked. You could start a document in a browser, you could write, and you could save it, and you could open it again in any other browser at any other time. It was saved against your name. They added a whole bunch of other features later and then moved towards making it comprehensive. But as a word editor, as a text editor, it was complete even with its first version was put out, right? And that bit is important. The last bit, delightful. We've spoken about this in other videos, but there are 4 layers of design. You need to build a product which is functional. You need to build a product which is reliable. Then you need to build a product which is usable. And finally, there's a layer of pleasurability. All these 4 layers put together is what make a product really, really delightful. But this is super critical. If your product does not do this, then it's not meeting the bar. It is not influencing any behavior. And it helps in this intangible way because it helps formulate opinions. And this bit is also very, very critical. This is where the market context comes in. This is where you know that the bar is slightly higher than the minimum bar set by the market. So make products which are beneficial, complete, and delightful, and that should be the first version of the product that you put out. And that perhaps is a different framing, a different way of looking at the MVP philosophy, because the MVP philosophy is phenomenal, and that's the right way of approaching things, but we seem to have corrupted it. And hopefully this is one lens through which you can look at the MVP philosophy and try and build better products. So I hope you've been enjoying these videos. Do subscribe to the channel, and I look forward to having you back in another playbook. Take care. Bye-bye.